this is where the biggest oil and natural gas reserves are confirmed in the Timor Sea. The center of attention is the Greater Sunrise oil field, which is still untapped and is worth about $40 billion. And here's the dispute. Whether Australia or East Timor has the right to drill these fields depends on where the maritime borders are drawn. Under UN law, each country is entitled to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, but this causes some overlap. Australia argues that the border should be drawn here, tossing the natural prolongation principle. This principle dictates that the maritime borders should, as far as possible, be drawn where the natural extension of its landmass ends, and this puts some of the biggest oil fields conveniently within Australia's exclusive economic zone. But East Timor raises a counter-argument and says that the border should instead be drawn here, tossing the median line principle. This principle dictates that the maritime border should conform to a median line between the two landmasses, and this puts much of the oil and the gas within the East Timorese borders. The two countries have agreed on some borders. In the 70s and 80s, they agreed on this being the seabed boundary, this being the boundary for commercial fisheries, and this was the agreed zone of cooperation. This zone was further divided into three areas: that of Indonesia, that of Australia, and the area where revenues are shared equally. But East Timorese officials now argue that Australia was getting the better end of that deal. And not unimportantly, the deal was made with the Indonesian government. When East Timor gained independence, that changed everything. In the years leading to the independence, Australia took measures to maintain its authority in the Timor Sea. In March 2002, Australia withdrew its recognition of several international bodies to solve maritime disputes. They were basically saying whatever they say, we don't acknowledge, so East Timor was left to its own devices. Then, they gained independence. A year later, East Timor and Australia reached their first agreement. They agreed on a new composition of the Timor Gap. Instead of dividing it into three zones, it was now one zone with East Timor getting 90% of the revenue and Australia 10%. But this agreement excluded some of the largest reserves. It's very likely that East Timor would get the full rights to the large Greater Sunrise field if Australia and East Timor would settle their maritime borders under international law. Australia knows this, and they have the leverage to postpone such an agreement.
Protests in East Timor are ramping up.
But the public pressure was mounting. Both in Australia and East Timor, people began protesting these accords, and partly therefore in 2006, they signed a new agreement. Australia and East Timor agreed to share the revenue of the Greater Sunrise 50-50, under the condition that they would not draw its maritime borders for another 50 years. Australia gets the oil, and East Timor gets a payday sooner rather than later. And this started preparations for drilling, which came with a whole new set of different challenges. But this time, they were making progress towards exploiting the oil and enriching both countries. But all of that came to a screeching halt in 2012. A former Australian spy confessed that the Australian government had bugged the cabinet room of East Timor. They were spying on them as they were negotiating the terms for the extraction. And this left the East Timorese feeling horribly betrayed. They felt that Australia had an unfair advantage, and they took the case to the International Court in The Hague. What East Timor wanted was to nullify their previous agreement. They felt it was finally time to draw their maritime borders once and for all. But the drama became more dramatic. Days before the court date in The Hague, the Australian Secret Service raided the offices of the East Timorese lawyers. They seized documents and took the passport of the infamous whistleblower. This created again public outrage in both East Timor and Australia. See, the UN has historically favored the median line argument, and if they would settle the dispute, it is very likely that East Timor would get all Greater Sunrise revenues. And this is something that Australia was trying to prevent. Court battles followed for the next several years, until in 2016, judges ruled that East Timor could nullify the agreement and both countries can pursue drawing its borders. In 2019, they agreed on what those borders would look like. It works as follows. The borders are close to the median line, but run through the Greater Sunrise Field. But East Timor has a significantly higher share of the revenue. They are entitled to 80% if they allow Australia to process the oil, or 70% if they run it through their own territory. East Timor gets a permanent maritime border as it had wanted for so long, and is now one step closer to extracting those resources. While in Australia, the deal is largely interpreted as the end of the dispute.